good enough group. I'm always confident JK is going to be happy to ask questions and have conversations and make statements. So as long as we got three of us in theory, I think that's not a terrible place for us to start. With that, I will actually just kick us off. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Tuesday as we continue the Delusing Bodies Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We are still we are going to be terminally forever in 4.3, chapter 4, section 3, which is exciting because it's really dense and bringing together a lot of things from earlier in the book and a lot of other sort of thinkers. We're in the process of going through Lacan, which is a whole thing. I will do my best to help guide us through it. I am not the Lacan expert, and Ken, who normally has been really busy lately and not able to join as often, which is a shame because it would be super, super useful. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and just dive in. I am sharing on my screen where we're at, if this works. There. Sharing my screen where we're at. The setup for us is pretty simple. Just a few new faces. As I go, I do a close reading of the paragraph. We try to go through mostly sentence by sentence, example by example. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have ideas or other thoughts, don't hesitate to jump in. We do our best to keep it organized, but we'll do what we can. Otherwise, I look forward to hearing what all of you think. Let's dive in. Everything hinges on the way in which the structure is elicited from the machines, according to planes of consistency or structuration, and lines of selection that correspond to the large statistical aggregates or molar formations and that determine the links and reduce production to representation. That is where the disjunctions become exclusive, and the connections global, and the conjunctions biunivocal. At the same time that the support gains a specificity under a structural unity, and the signs themselves become signifying under the action of a despotic symbol that totalizes them in the name of its own absence or withdrawal. Yes, in fact, there the production of desire can be represented only in terms of an extrapolated sign that joins together all the elements of production, in a constellation of which it is not itself a part. There, the absence of a tie necessarily appears as an absence and no longer a positive force. There, desire is necessarily referred to a missing term whose very essence is to be lacking. The signs of desire, being non-signifying, become signifying in representation only in terms of a signifier of absence or lack. The structure is formed and appears only in terms of the symbolic term defined as lack. The great other, as the non-human sex, gives way in representation to a signifier of the great other as an always missing term, the all-too-human sex, the phallus of molar castration. God damn, it's like diving straight in. I'm so sorry for any of you who are just joining us on this one. I do want to read a little bit of Eckrits here at the bottom. It's a footnote where Lacan talks about the phallus of castration. For want of this signifier, all the others would represent nothing. Serge Leclerc shows how the structure is organized around a missing term, or rather, a signifier of lack. Quote, "It is the elective signifier of the absence of a link, the phallus, that we find again in unique privilege of its relation to the essence of lack, an emblem of difference par excellence. The point in the language system there is a guarantor of the irreducibility of lack, the phallic signifier." How strange all this is. So, to start, we have just kind of come around and talked through the previous few paragraphs how desire forms elements, how these partial objects come together, how to phrase it, how the structure of Lacan's sort of symbolic thinking comes about, and how do they explain this? How do they critique it? How do they have this discussion is kind of the underlying, I think, point of this paragraph, and they tend to dive straight fucking in, to say the least. And it is not an easy paragraph, so it may be best we go line by line, unless someone, Jack, do you want to try to take a top line? through this? Because this is dense, and I
Yeah,
think line by line is probably the only way to do it, but go for it.
yeah. I'll try and give us a guiding theme for line over line then. Um, so we just saw Deleuze and Guattari going through Lacan, right? And it's a similar point they make with Freud, that they have this conceptual lucidity to their work, right? That their work can't just be wholesaled as wrong, incorrect, or something not worth engaging. What they're parsing out here now, especially following, right? So Freud doesn't have structuralism in his time, right? Lacan's working on that rubric, or at least working with that rubric to some degree. Uh, the move I see them making here now is to say both of them are dealing with representation and therefore repression, right? And that provides an entry point for structuration. That structuration now depends on the relationship of the molecular and the molar, which is to say that it's not so much that one precedes the other, it is to say that there's no structuration without that relationship, right? And that structuration, which right depends on this relationship so as to produce a representation. Um, that is where we start getting the three basically it'll be five in a minute, but the three paralogisms more directly, right? You get lack, something in the assemblage that seems to be absent, and therefore defines the assemblage, provides it some sort of transcendent unity. You get law, right, or the exclusive disjunction, either this or that. He put it in, like the gender terms they used earlier, right? Either male or female, um, either bisexual, homosexual, right? There's this categorical kind of importance. I don't want to say imperative, but there's a categorical fixation, and you get biunivocalization, which is just to say that um, in a simple sense, right, subjectivities are being conflated. They're being represented so that the um, the effects and the way that they're consummating reality is being eschewed for kind of a representation of what that would be.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Tiernan nails it. It's either to say you fit the bill of representation or you don't. And that a long sentence. It's a beast to read. But to say cleanly, sort of the part of it that I think helps with that. Um, Lines of consistency, structuration, planes of consistency or structuration, and lines of selection that correspond to large statistical aggregates, which are again laws of large numbers on average. What are people? What do people do? Man, woman. These large aggregates, or molar formations, representations that determine the links and reduce production to this representation. These sort of laws of large numbers. That is where the disjunctions become exclusive, one or the other, as Jack's talking about. To this moment happens, the connections then become global. You connect to all men, all women, rather than persons, and the conjunctions biunivocal. Uh, again, turning into two rather than just connecting as they do. At the same time, the support gains a specificity under a structural unity, and the signs themselves become signifying under the action of a despotic symbol that totalizes them in the name of its own absence or withdrawal. This is the last bit, specifically talking about this the nature of representation in itself is kind of talking through how lack is produced in the nature of how representation works within the Deleuze and Guattarian sense. For Lacan, lack is formed, and it's not far from D&G. You first experience lack, say, as an infant. You are breastfeeding. It's one of the first experiences we all have as humans. You're being fed. At some point during that feeding, it stops. That's kind of it. This moment creates a lack for Lacan, because where you were just being completely satisfied, excited, living, oh my God, this is amazing. Now suddenly you've had the thing pulled away and you understand that nothing is everything you want it to be, essentially. You can't just feed forever. It's not just the infinite breast and infinite milk. Instead, everything lacks. And so lack becomes this sort of core thing that creates desire in Lacan's uh, sort of setup of the world. for here, they're talking about sort of the same setup that this large scale, these representations of things have lack. This is accurate, but that lack is uh, produced actually as part of it. As they say here, in fact, there the production of desire can be represented only in terms of extrapolated signs that join together all the elements of production, and a constellation of which it is not itself a part. When signs are produced, representations are produced, they're produced effectively by desire, but desire is not within representations. Representations are, think of them as almost a dust, uh, dried husks of where desire once was. It forms and then it leaves it, and we're able to see kind of where desire sat. And we, oh, well, this is, we wanted to fuck this, we wanted to eat that. These things sort of exist, but desire is no longer within it. This is what they're talking about. There are there at this moment, this constellation of all of these desiring machines connecting. We're able to see this thing, this new representation. And there, the absence of a tie necessarily appears as an absence, no longer as a positive force. Desire is no longer inside of the representations. When I say I'm interested in my sexual partner, my desire is not inside of the words I'm using or even the representation I have of them. It doesn't work that same way. It's referring, when we talk about desire, to this missing element. The signs of desire, being non-signifying, become signifying in representation only in terms of an absence or lack. The structure that is formed and appears only in terms of the symbolic term defined as lack, and the great other, in Lacanian sense, as the non-human sex gives way in representation to a signifier of the great other as an always missing term, the all too human sex, the phallus of molar castration. That's how I understand this paragraph, and I hope it explained it at least slightly okay. Please ramble and tell me where I'm wrong.
Would it be fair to say that the Oedipal complex is kind of buried in the structure of Lacan's, symbols and the imaginary, and that it is still, the lack of a the lack is really an expression of that despotic complex, uh, right? So
Yes.
that last, yeah, so that last part, that first sentence, that long sentence, is despotic symbol that totalizes them in the name of its own absence or withdrawal. So the lack becomes the manifestation of the Oedipal complex and the despotic signifier, right?
It becomes the touchstone that sort of, like Ice Nine in Vonnegut's work, crystallizes and creates the structure as it moves. Yeah, the phallus plays a unique role. Again, they're not overall like shitting on everything Lacan did, the same way that they're not like doing a hyper critique of Freud saying he's terrible. Freud's idea around libido and this understanding of sort of abstracting out how desire operates was a monumental moment in the history of humanity. Lacan, while trying to undo Freud, to run forward with a lot of the problems, you don't actually want to fuck your mom. You don't actually hate your dad. Instead, these things represent, there's larger representations and symbolism at play inside of this. And here's the structure of thought that Oedipus is actually pointing at, is sort of how Lacan plays it. And they're saying, no, actually, by starting in this way, we actually produce this structure, desire does. And then when desire moves on or desire is no longer there and the structure hardens, suddenly we have this lack built into it. We've produced the lack in our very nature of building the structure. That's their critique of Lacan, sort of short version.
Yeah, I read one commentary where the guy even said that Lacan was the first anti-Oedipus, but you can see that the Oedipal uh, drives are buried in the structure, and it's manifested in this kind of lack.
Well, that's the great line they have about Lacan, is that he's someone who tied explosives to the pillars to blow them up, only to have them blow up, but then fall directly back into the holes that they made. This perfect explosion that sort of just didn't really change very much, but moved the goalposts. It's a great formation they have around that. But again, a lot of this Lacan's stuff that he's playing with is to sort of, how to put it, Lacan is basically trying to push these ideas in order to create this critique of Freud, and he doesn't get far enough. Guattari really goes into it in some other texts as well, sort of because he studied under Lacan. He came from that world. He has a wonderful grasp of it. That it's just we need to go further. We need to really play with these things in a very different spot, and we'll kind of get into that in the next paragraph. Because Lacan's play is not as hardcore as Freud's when it comes to Oedipus, but it's a little insidious in a unique way.
Yeah, as I kind of think about it, right? So Lacan's not exactly wrong. He gets that there's the molecular and the mold. His work makes it possible to get this molecular molar distinction, right? He opens up a lot of doors. Where they kind of have this level of auto critique is right. I think they seem to begin at a point where the use of structure as represent and that play in representation, that becomes the conflation of the molar and the molecular, right? So that you
Mm-hmm.
end up with that representation. And it's a very subtle point, but I think it fits really well because if you follow that line of critique, especially as we're about to get into, the point about Oedipus and that, right? It's really interesting how that changes your perspective on Lacanian thought, right? Because on one hand, he sees the right, in a sense you can say he sees the desiring production, he sees representation. On the other hand, kind of like you're saying, Brooks, right? There's something happening just like with Freud that causes the representation to take precedence, right? And this is kind of their larger point about political economy and psychoanalysis going hand in hand. That the fashioning of the representation and thereby the paralogisms, right? These are two technologies to facilitate that political economy and psychoanalysis.
Any questions on this section? Any other thoughts before I move to the next bit, as Jack and I have been alluding to? It wouldn't hurt to have a really solid understanding of Lacan during this, but that's like telling someone to have a solid understanding of Hegel in order to read Marx. Um, I wouldn't recommend it. Well, and I'm not sure it's possible to the level that really is needed. There's some excellent secondary sources and readings and writings on this, including my favorite, which is Holland, but uh, there's a few other really great ones. I know Felix Buchanan's piece goes into a little bit more on Lacan and juxtaposes them, but it's a little bit more difficult. Hopefully we can start making more sense of it, because now they're starting to get into some more specifics around Lacan. Here, too, Lacan's approach appears in all its complexity, for it is certain that he does not enclose the unconscious in an Oedipal structure. He shows, on the contrary, that Oedipus is imaginary, nothing but an image, a myth, that this or these images are produced by an Oedipalizing structure, that the structure acts only insofar as it reproduces the element of castration, which itself is not imaginary, but symbolic. There, we have three major planes of structuration, which correspond to the molar aggregates. Oedipus as the imaginary reterritorialization of private man, produced under the structural conditions of capitalism, inasmuch as capitalism reproduces and revives the archaism of the imperial symbol of the vanished or the vanished despot. All three are necessary, precisely in order to lead Oedipus to the point of self-critique. The task undertaken by Lacan is to lead Oedipus to such a point. Likewise, Elizabeth Roudinesco has clearly seen that in Lacan, the hypothesis of an unconscious as language does not closet the unconscious in a linguistic structure, but leads linguistics to the point of its autocritique, by showing how the structural organization of signifiers still depends on a despotic great signifier acting as an archaism. Oh, God. I really wish Ken were here. God damn it.
I guess then I'm no Ken, but just to kick it off then. So as I read the text, I've always struggled with like molecular, molar, and representational relationship. On this paragraph kind of helps me because as I read it, there's like this, right? Like we were just saying, there's this relationship between the molecular and the molar, between desiring production and social production. And that through a process of lines of selection, like they were saying, right? There is a representation developed that fits social production and thereby, I think, um, in a manner of speaking, transcends social production to represent it and thereby representing um, the molecular, right? And this structuration, part of this process of lines of selection, that the use of the paralogisms, um, plays into three main pieces of Oedipus, right? So you got Oedipus as the imaginary reterritorialization of private man, produced under the structural conditions of capitalism, inasmuch as capitalism reproduces and revives the archaism. Oh, yep, sorry. So number two is produced under the structural conditions of capitalism. And number three is inasmuch as capitalism reproduces and revives the archaism of the imperial symbol or the vanished despot. Right? So I'll kick off the first one and then I'll turn over to someone else to analyze. But just with that first point about structuration, right? Oedipus is the imaginary reterritorialization of private man. The thing that sticks out to me there is, right? So in the relationship of the molar and molecular, Oedipus deploys a movement to the imaginary that is a reterritorialization, in a sense, a rezoning of of I don't want to just say private man, but of global persons more directly, right? Of people in the aggregate, particularly in the social field. And by doing that, there's a reimagining taking place, right? And this facilitates this kind of first level of representational consistency.
I think for the second one, which is produced under the structural conditions of capitalism, an example of that may be, and again, I'm no expert, but an example of that may be how Lacan comes to, for example, look at the father, the name of the father. This idea that it's not literally the father, instead, it's about how the law is perceived within the economic system and that you're in, which is capitalism. So, this idea of the reterritorialization of this private man produced under the structural conditions of capitalism, that being the determining factor of what law means, which in these terms is what the father means, which is Oedipus and how it plays. This odd segregation of things and separation out feels like that one is probably close.
What are the three major planes of structuration again? Is that the imaginary, symbolic, and the socius?
No, it is Oedipus is the imaginary reterritorialization of private man,
Uh-huh. Okay.
the production of that under the structural conditions of capitalism, and then finally, and
Reviving
in
the
as much
archaism of
as,
the imperial symbol return the despot, whatever it may be, the vanished
thank you,
despot.
and I like your point too, because what you're getting at is the second paralogism that fit really nicely.
I think it fits. I think it fits here because it's the flow of it as we go through the planes of structuration, which is the literally the building of the structure. The private man is reterritorialized through Oedipus. Oedipus creates based on the structural conditions inherent to the system, specifically capitalism, and in this case, in our case, and then all of that as well, reviving the imperial symbol, the vanished despot inside of that. And again, the name of the father, I think, is an interesting one because this is the big other, the determining, the despot that overwatches and is always there. All three of those come back, and this really leads Oedipus to the point of self-critique, as they talk about. But that's the next paragraph. But that feels like, I don't know. That feels like close, maybe.
Can I make 2 points maybe?
Please.
In this sentence that we were reading, I wanted to make a point about the first part, Oedipus as the imaginary re-territorialization of private man. Since it is imaginary, I wanted to add from psychoanalysis that imaginary in only if it relates to that is in the sense of imaginary representation, which is related to the ego. And
Yes.
if it's, as I'm saying, it is the part which is related to the ego, this first part. The second one is related to the structural conditions of capitalism, but goes goes in relation to the third part, which is inasmuch as capitalism reproduces and revives the archaism of the imperial symbol. I don't know what they mean by imperial symbol. Maybe they're pointing to something they discussed maybe earlier. But the vanishing despot in maybe not in Lacan, because I'm not very much acquainted with Lacan, but from Badiou, reading Lacan, I could say that the vanishing despot is a vanishing term. And as a vanishing term, it emerges a new metaphor. I mean, a new division, a new two like the number. Which Badiou says one divides into two. But this division is made by a vanishing term. And this vanishing term opens up two metonymical chains, which in Lacan, I think they are symbolic chains, by which, in this sense, maybe it opens up for Oedipus precisely in order to lead Oedipus to the point of self-critique. We might see what this self-criticism is, but I wanted to make these points since we're missing some background maybe from Lacan. And
Well, one, that helps so much.
just
Thank you
wanted to
so
add that.
very much. Just saying thank you. Please continue if you have anything that's
Yeah.
absolutely helpful. And my money is the way they've been referring to this, and anyone feel free to disagree. The archaism of the imperial symbol or the vanished despot, when they use that term, I think they're aiming at the despotic socius specifically, because what we've had moved as we talk about the switch to capital is that we still have the despot. The despot's vanished. The imperial symbol of the king's whatever press or the crown or whatever it is becomes capital. It sort of gets stamped into capital at this point and becomes that element, but it's kind of moved to this really weird place where it's now an archaism instead of the thing. Because one of the other things they've talked about with Lacan, and I think it's a fair general critique of Lacan, is he does kind of play back to this idea of the despot within people, whether it's the big other or how the ego's formed or how lack forms. There's a play from that direction. So I think that's what they're referring to there, which is in line with what you're saying also, because I think that does follow from, and I'm not an expert on Badiou, but that does sound Badooey, which is not a word. But sorry to ramble. I like that. I
Maybe
like that take. I like that take a lot.
let's see maybe what's on the self-criticism, and maybe we can adjust some things if I got that wrong maybe.
Yeah, we'll read the next paragraph and we'll find out which how many of us are way off. Well, we'll find out how far off I am because I'm generally kind of far off. And it's
I,
also real quick though, at the end of the paragraph, they have the phrase, the structural organization of signifiers still depends on a despotic great signifier acting as an archaism. This sounds to me like the Lacanian idea of the master signifier that they're referring to, the vanished despot, the imperial symbol, the signifier that all other meaning is generated from. That element in that element inside of the symbolic for Lacan, if we're talking about imaginary and symbolic, is massive. It's core to his entire concept of the signifying chain and how we derive meaning from everything. We need the master signifier that itself doesn't necessarily have sort of its own meaning, but all exists almost as a reference that exists to other elements. It doesn't, nothing connects to it. Everything connects to it. It doesn't connect to anything, kind of thing. The idea of the master signifier feels like that's what they're pointing at too.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's it though. They'll call it the despot signifier. It's pretty much the same thing. The point is just to get that it's at the second socius you really get that, or at least that it changes from the first socius, right? Because to add on to your point,
Did I lose you, Jack?
I think what ends up happening with the archaism is you have overcoding and recoding, right?
Can anyone hear
So you've
me?
got that
Or am
layering
I
of bricks like
disconnecting
we
from the
had in the
internet?
allusion to Kafka, but you've also got that process of decoding so as to recode, right? So things are kind of seeming to change here. And I think
Okay, so Jack is the one disconnecting.
that's the
Thank
last
God.
point I would
I
make
was
here is this
terrified for a
point
moment
about
there.
correspondence,
Jack, you're
right?
not coming through at all, dude.
Because
Well, you're breaking through. We'll go ahead and move to the next.
sure.
We'll move to the next paragraph, and then if we'll see if we can get your audio working again. So to the point, Kedis made. We'll get to self-criticism. What is this point of self-criticism? It is the point where the structure, beyond the images that fill it and the symbolic that conditions it within representation, reveals its reverse side as a positive principle of non-consistency that dissolves it, where desire is shifted into the order of production related to its molecular elements, and where it lacks nothing because it is defined as the natural and sensuous objective being at the same time as the real is defined as the objective being of desire. For the unconscious of schizoanalysis is unaware of persons, aggregates and laws, and of images, structures, and symbols. It is an orphan, just as it is an anarchist and an atheist. It is not an orphan in the sense that the father's name would designate an absence, but in the sense that the unconscious reproduces itself wherever the names of history designate present intensities, the sea of proper names. The unconscious is not figurative, since its figural is abstract, the figure schiz. It is not structural, nor is it symbolic, for its reality is that of the real in its very production, in its very inorganization. It is not representative, but solely machinic and productive.
Is my mic working now?
Hey, look at you.
Hey. No,
Look at
listen to
you
me.
with technology and shit.
Yeah, maybe one day. Although I am Gregory Peccary, I'm responsible for the creation of the calendar.
There we go.
Anyways, that was the point. So where they start off on that was the point I was trying to get the conclusion there is there's a correspondence with the molar with social production that's critical for representation, right? There has to be this kind of, one way to say it is the seeming symmetry, right? This is part of why I think it's so effective is it can look that way, it can appear that way. The representation can appear um, as the molar, right? This point about the reterritorialization of private man, that global persons can be represented this way, more so that social production takes on this kind of appearance. And I see that as being where they're starting out here, right? Is that the auto critique is important. And this is where they push Lacan to his auto critique in some ways, because what the auto critique does is it breaks the symmetry. Might even say it shows us how questionable the symmetry was in the first place. Go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth taking a second to talk about the real inside of Lacan because I was wondering in the previous paragraph, and I've read this book a bunch of times. I don't know why I do this, but in the previous paragraph, they outlined the imaginary and the symbolic as Kedis really nailed. They're talking about kind of these elements, but they don't say the real, and the real is fairly central to Lacan's entire take of things. If you want to say it that way, I would say that. The nature of Lacan is you have sort of the imaginary, which is how to put it. Hmm, I mean, it's where the ego sits. The uh, it's the space where we believe we exist. It's the sort of, I don't know how to put it.
Sounds like, based on what you guys are saying, it sounds like
Preconscious, preconscious
conscious.
is preconscious is how he talks about it. I'm trying to think of a way that's not necessarily psychoanalytic to describe it, because Jesus Christ, like, these things are meaningless to the average person and very much to anyone who hasn't like dove into Lacan.
If I may add, for the ego, you might call it an imaginary representation of our body. All the play is done in the ego. I mean,
Yeah, it's the way the world appears to us. Is that like too stupid to say? It's
eh, well, in some sense, you can say that because the imaginary representation is and the imaginary representation of the world is made according to um, um, an imaginary body in some sense, and that imaginary body is configured in the ego. If you're familiar with Z or Zeta schema in Lacan,
yeah.
ego is where the work is done with the patient, and there is where you can start to read the schema.
It's
So you
it's the
have
element that arrives. Sorry, it's the element that arrives during the mirror stage, where an infant realizes they exist, they start to see themselves, and they begin constructing representations around this process. Sort of at that moment, it's decidedly narcissistic and ego-driven world creation with yourself at the center, kind of. Idealized desires, idealized representations are formed during that. Am I far off? I'm trying to find an easy way to describe it, because it's important that like we get across this not directly in a Lacanian way, because the frustration I have then is what they're doing here is they're talking about this point of self-criticism where we flip things. To do that, we have to have like a real good feeling and understanding of what the side is we're flipping. And the side we're flipping is the symbolic and the imaginary, this place of the narcissism and the representations that are created, and the structure that, as they say, beyond the images that fill it, the imaginary, and the symbolic that conditions it within the representation. We have the reverse side, which is the real, as they say here, and they play with. But it's really this is a tough one, because you need a background in Lacan. So I'm sorry if I'm rambling.
No, these are phenomenal points.
Sorry, Kedis, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm trying to find a way for us to get to that point.
no
Please continue.
pardon. I in a way, I just wanted to make that point about the ego, because it is easier to grasp the role of the ego and the formation of the ego. But I think you put it rightly. If we had somebody from the with a background from psychoanalysis, we would had a better definition about these concepts, but we still can grasp them, and we have good enough grasp on them. Maybe I'll search about the schema I was telling you about in the meanwhile, and maybe with image in front of us, maybe I can add something more.
Yeah,
Just
I
let me
think
know.
no, that would be great. So yeah, the side we're talking about, and I think they're making this very particular play. This idea that we have the imaginary and the symbolic, which flow together. They're very much together and intertwined and rely on each other. Ultimately, they are constantly at tension with the other side of things because we have the imaginary and the symbolic, which are our perceptions of the world as an ego, conditioned by the symbolic order we find ourselves in and the social structures. Those are the two elements. The real is the other side. The real is the infant. This is where I think D&G, cross directly over. The infant just wants. Lacan, I think, refers to it as needs rather than desires, but I think sort of it's not drastically different. It's this idea that just there is want or desire or things, but the infant doesn't have names for things. It doesn't understand the shape of stuff. It just knows, give me things, I have needs or wants, depending on who you're talking through. That is the state of the real. But at some point when we realize we exist or we enter into language or we enter into the symbolic order, we no longer can perceive the real directly. The real has no meaning in itself. This the Zizek's term, "Welcome to the Desert of the Real," that everyone's used, that his book was called. This is kind of from that. It's also the Desert of the Real line in Matrix is very much intended to be representative of this underlying thing as well. This other side, though, that is for Lacan need, to them, they see this other side as they say very clearly here, because it is defined as the natural and sensuous objective being, at the same time as the real is defined as the objective being of desire. For the unconscious of schizoanalysis is unaware of persons, aggregates and laws, images, structures, and symbols. It is an orphan, but it's not an orphan because the father did something or its relationship. It doesn't know the fucking father. It doesn't give a shit about the father. The unconscious itself just reproduces itself wherever the names of history designate present intensities. The sea of proper names is a reference to their earlier points about how the schizos in treatment or various people are able to just pluck out who they are at any given time. What are their proper names? Who are we at any given moment? That is the sea of proper names based on, essentially my momentary contingencies. And that direct bit of the real, they see this as the unconscious, the place of desire. It's not figurative, since its figural is abstract. It doesn't have a figure. It is not structural, nor is it symbolic, for its reality is that of the real in its very production, its very organization, in organization. It is not representative, but solely machinic and productive. Oh, and see, this is the diagrams that you're going to pull up, Geddes. And there's not a slight against you. Lacan's diagrams I've always found almost hilarious because it's like he puts them in there to help you understand. And I've only had the opposite experience. Like, oh, okay, I thought I grasped it. Now I see this and I don't know.
I
But
couldn't
please.
find any in English, but I'll try to. I remember most of them, and I think I can get them right. We start from the lower left corner, and there is the ego, and there is the position of the subject in question, or the analyzed in Lacan, and that A is in some sense the imaginary body with which the small other, which is in the upper right corner, is reflected, is made sense to. And this relation from A to A prime, from left bottom corner to, from the ego, and to the right up is the imaginary relation. So for every object in the world, the upper right corner, there is an imaginary position related to the form, the shape of the body in the left bottom corner. I wouldn't like to enter into specific details because I'm not into psychoanalysis, and I wouldn't like to say things that they are not, but I would like to go to the other points.
Please,
Just as briefly
by
as
the way,
these.
that was a very fair description of all of it as far as I'm aware. So I wouldn't say you don't understand psychoanalysis. You have a pretty decent grasp, for sure.
Thanks. I'll try to make sense of this one. So from the bottom left corner where the ego is, the moi, we move to the bottom right corner, which is the big other. And the point of the big other in this sense is to posit, or maybe it is the position, the positing of, of the laws in which we recognize the small other, which is above it. And these laws, as you can see, are on the unconscious part of the psyche, because there where is written inconscient, is from French unconscious, I think. And this is on the unconscious side of the psyche. So the laws are, of course, are unconsciously settled in this sense, but choosing the right big other means choosing, in some sense, the right laws in which to judge or to apprehend the small other which is in front of us. Why the big other is in the unconscious side? It is it is related to the laws from the page you were reading. It is because it's structured in language, and it is the same language we use to make sense of the other in relation to our body, which is the ego, the left. So we have 3 points of the schema right now. I think the other and the final point is the symbolic relation, there where the S is. And the symbolic relation and the symbolic development happens in that position. But still, I hope it's something, because I wouldn't like to go into further details. Maybe Ken is very used to this, and maybe we can ask him the next time.
Well, we'll try to get him in here to say simply. I will do my best, but to say simply, one of the things Lacan really gets at throughout Eckhart and Badiou as well is just in general how language allows people to talk. To put it like, just how do I say something to someone, know that those words are going to mean the things, be able to have a conversation. Well, I do that by utilizing kind of this structure. And in order to do it, my relationship with any subject is necessarily based on my own experiences, but it's based on also what my language, or the collective language we have, is conditioned by. And that conditioning is done by the big other, or really also the little other in its own way, through sort of imaginary relations, which is that middle line going back from the little a, the other, to myself, to the ego. It's a really interesting schema that plays with the idea that the nature of things aren't necessarily the things themselves, that the imaginary hides the sort of structure underneath. That's what it does. That's kind of its job. And the structure underneath is something that we can't necessarily directly deal with, this being the real. We don't have the ability to see it directly. We can't experience it directly. It's impossible for us. And so as we play with these things and as they get into it, their critique here is the self-criticism of it is, it's sort of built in to get to that real, what the real is. To them, it's this positive principle of non-consistency. It's an affirmation of the nature of the real that Lacan sees as chaotic and impossible to understand, and they agree. But to them, it's a productive chaos, machinic in nature, that perhaps too complex for us to directly comprehend, and certainly has nothing to do with representation. But things come out of this, and that's that last line here. Its reality is that of the real, capital R, in its very production, in its very inorganization. It is not representative, but solely machinic and productive. And here, this is where they start getting into their take on Lacan, their take on lack, and their take on desire, and all of these things. And this last bit, I'll move to the next paragraph, which is a little bit longer, but they start getting into sort of directly schizoanalysis. Jack, let's make a note to annoy Ken and get him next week, or when we do a review of this. We may have to do a review of this because this is like 4.3. This is our fifth reading in a row. We're going to get through maybe 2 paragraphs before we finish the day. So let's see if we can get Ken for a review of this and spend time on it. But I'll finish the next paragraph. Destroy, destroy. The task of schizoanalysis goes by way of destruction, a whole scouring of the unconscious, a complete curettage. Destroy Oedipus, the illusion of the ego, the puppet of the superego, guilt, the law, castration. It is not a matter of pious destructions, such as those performed by psychoanalysis under the benevolent neutral eye of the analyst, for these are Hegel-style destructions, ways of conserving. How is it that the celebrated neutrality, and what is psychoanalysis dares to call, the disappearance or the dissolution of the Oedipus complex does not make us burst into laughter? We are told that Oedipus is indispensable, that it is the source of every possible differentiation, and that it saves us from the terrible non-differentiated mother. But this terrible mother, the Sphinx, is herself part of Oedipus. Her non-differentiation is merely the reverse of the exclusive differentiations created by Oedipus. She is herself created by Oedipus. Oedipus necessarily operates in the form of this double impasse. We are told that Oedipus, in its turn, must be overcome, and that this is achieved through castration, latency, desexualization, and sublimation. But what is castration if not still Oedipus, to the nth power, now symbolic and therefore all the more virulent? And what is latency, this pure fable, if not the silence imposed on desiring machines, so that Oedipus can develop, be fortified in us, so that it can accumulate its poisonous sperm and gain the time necessary for propagating itself and for passing on to our future children? And what is the elimination of castration anxiety in its turn? Desexualization and sublimation, if not divine acceptance of and infinite resignation to bad conscience, which exists for the woman of the appeased wish for a penis, destined to be converted into a wish for a baby and for a husband, and for the man in assuming his passive attitude and in subjecting himself to a father substitute. I will leave the analysis to you, Jack. I have to run to the restroom. I'll be right back. It's a pretty crisp paragraph, so you okay? You good?
Yeah, I can kick it
All right.
off.
Lead away. I'll be back.
Where to start? I guess where I would start is so we just finished talking about how basically, right, at least how I understand the previous paragraph, is their point is, if you put in classic, like Freudian psychoanalytic language, um, the basic development is that representations, it's kind of an evolution of the reality and the pleasure principle, right? Where the pleasure principle desires at the point of the id, and those pleasures and not those desires more or less are the meat of the unconscious, um, with some complices like Oedipus kind of tossed in there later on by Freud, right? And the ego's job is to basically negotiate that through the reality principle and tie those desires to objects in reality. And so the big move I see them making here is that this aspect of representation, right, is got this uncanniness with the unconscious. And that's why it's kind of this orphan, because the unconscious is basically, um, in a sense, it breaks with the representation more directly. It was never of the representation, right? And this is their big move because this point about auto critique, this point about how Oedipus relates to the unconscious, what it does in developing an auto critique. This is, I think, the primary, or at least a primary aspect of schizoanalysis, where they write destroy, destroy, right? What they're getting at is more or less kind of the breaking of this uncanniness. Um, and it should call to mind, I think, what they say earlier about capital as destroying and disseminating codes in that, right? But there's a difference, right? There's a difference in the schizophrenic element here. There's a difference in this destruction. And that is to say, right, political economy and psychoanalysis, this kind of Hegelian point they're making here, or this point about that Hegelianism, is to conserve what is being reconfigured, right? To change it anew. And that's one form of uncanniness, the way the representation is changing, right? Kind of do a morphology there. On the other hand, that destruction of the representation such that we um, are focusing on the unconscious in terms of its syllogisms, right? This different form of uncanniness. That kind of destruction, that lets loose the unconscious and its production. And by doing so, right, we're not dealing with the reality principle in terms of its preconsciousness, in terms of what the ego does for desire, right? Or what structure allows the ego to do, said in a different way. Instead, we're dealing with desire as the production of the real, and therefore, right, we are dealing with reality in its production, thereby in its change, right? It is shifting, it is morphing, it's reconfiguring, right? There's this whole element of production that consummates the subjectivity of the unconscious, right? It consummates it as the subject. And I think that's, in a nutshell, what schizoanalysis is getting at. Um, in some sense, it's an uncanniness of the representation being destroyed and allowing the unconscious to basically, um, to produce itself, right? To produce itself without cause for reference to a representation, which is why psychoanalysis gets their laughter, right? Is, well, you say you're tearing down Oedipus, but then we're right back into a different element of Oedipus, or we're at a different point of it, or Oedipus is different, right? The clubbed foot is on the other leg, so to speak. But I mean, that's kind of how I see it. What do you guys think?
So is he critiquing Lacan or this kind of uncanniness in his structuralism of the Oedipal complex?
I mean, we've always got to be, but I think it's fair to say they bring Lacan to a point of autocritique. They're also pointing out that their kind of reading of Lacan is to say that he is trying to do what they're doing, right? So it's kind of if you think about the classic Lacanian point that he considers himself to be kind of this true interpreter of Freud, right? They're kind of saying, right, well, then as the true interpreter of Freud, in our interpretation of you, you are the supposed to be destroying Oedipus, right? Um, and so in that point, in when Lacanian psychoanalysis fails to do so, when it remains caught in structuration, it is at a point. Schizoanalysis is there to bring it to a point of autocritique, right? Because it would have the potential to do what schizoanalysis does, but that potential is caught up in the representation, right? Caught up in structure, which they think Lacan is, which they read Lacan as not trying to do, as pointing it out and trying to do something about it as opposed to being caught up in it. Even though they point out that he does get caught up in it, right? There's a point they're being made, they're very carefully making here.
Well, Lacan is lacking this kind of autocritique.
Yeah, it's possible for him, but he doesn't always get there, right?
Yeah.
Like the pylon joke Brooks brought up, right? It's possible, but then it merits our laughter when we go from Oedipus to the Sphinx, right? We're right back. We didn't really go anywhere, right? You just kind of change scenes, same movie. It's not the infernal machine, right?
So there's in Lacan, there's nowhere he has any critique of capitalism, does he?
I don't know if Lacan's considering political economy. Deleuze and Guattari seem to think that he's got an eye on social production, right, and representation. So at some level, it probably factors in. But I don't know how much further it goes than that.
Because the way Zizek, makes use of Lacan, he seems to have a more of a Hegelian and Marxist critique of social production.
Yeah, it's ironic to be. It's ironic to say that right after we just read the line for these are Hegel-style destructions, ways of conserving. But yeah, Zizek is definitely. I think he does try to take Lacan into it, that kind of realm.
I'd like to make some point on the last question concerning the engagement of Lacan or maybe even Freud on political economy. I don't think they really engaged in political economy. Maybe even if they're touched upon themes, for example, I can recall civilization and discontents from Freud. It's somehow he tries to go from the field of psychoanalysis to enter in the field of society, which is related to politics, and different critics say that he is being political. And when everyone tries to say that I'm not trying to be political, like Freud maybe mentions in the Civilization and Discontent text, they say that that's precisely the moment where he is trying to be political. We can find such moments in different texts from Freud. For example, there are some texts related to anthropology, and there was some how do you say it? I can't find the right word, but Freud exchanged some letters with Einstein to seek a way to stop wars, but it was an engagement from the United Nations to get Einstein to collect the greatest minds of the time, and he wrote to Freud, and there is another text where Freud engaged in such conversations. I think you can find such texts even in Lacan, but none of them really engaged in matters of politics. On the other side, there is Marx, which wrote, strictly speaking, critics to the political economy, the capital, I mean. And that is political economy, but in his political economy, there lacks the consideration from the perspective of the human subject, I would roughly say. This part from Lacan and Freud. People usually try, many people, I think, I'm not just talking for people in general, try to make a relation between Marx and other authors on his side, Marxists basically, and the psychoanalysis from Freud and Lacan. In this point, Badiou mentions that it would be a fool's bridge to create this relation between Marxists and psychoanalysis, but on the other side, they both shed light on each other. This strain of thought is generally treated in Badiou theory of the subject, and if somebody might be interested, they can find it on theory of the subject. And the reason why there's no real relation in between psychoanalysis and Marxism is because they're not really related. They do not have an area in which they overlap, but you can find them both related in the philosophy of Badiou, for example. And I think the example of Deleuze-Guattari is another one, but I don't know very good Deleuze and Guattari as much as I know Badiou, and that's why I'm taking the Badiou example. In Badiou, you can find both treated, both explained and read in detail, because Marxism stands on the truth of the political events or the political truths. Meanwhile, psychoanalysis stands on the truth of love. And if you're acquainted with Badiou's philosophy, there are 4 types of truths. The truths in love, truths in politics, and somehow Badiou explains that love is the minimal political subject, the subject made of 2, not of many, like politics. And there are 2 other truths, the scientific truths and the truths of art, works of art, I mean, in this sense. And while Badiou is in his philosophy, as I understand it, while Badiou is trying to deal with the emancipation of society because of his event of the May 68, which it hit Badiou in some sense and made him engage in critical thinking and made him develop in different seminars theory of the subject. He's trying in some sense to make, not to make, but to shed some light on the necessary qualities the society in that time needed to engage in. And there was where he developed the theory about these four types of truth I'm talking about, which you can find in more detail in Theory of the Subject. I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, I definitely think that's one of the big problematics kind of post-Freud, right? Is because we see like the Frankfurt School, and we see obviously in France a lot of thinkers are trying to figure out what to do with Marxism and what to do with Freud, right? Particularly psychoanalysis. By the same token, right, you even get thinkers like Sartre, right? How do we take Marxism and that's essentialism and make a method out of that? And that's kind of the interesting thing is like Deleuze and Guattari, Klosowski, um, and perhaps even Badiou. I'm not as familiar with them. They seem to be able to pull off that. I don't want to say they're just trying to combine them, but they seem to be able to pull off developing a method out of the two. That's pretty convincing,
Well,
right?
I do want to mention also real quick, because how I came to Lacan is actually through Marx. Um, the the big fuzzy bear that Zizek is totally does his work towards sort of fusing the two and bringing them together. But Pierre Bruno's sort of book on the symptom is, I found, fantastic for sort of understanding sort of what might be a really nice gap between them. And then Samo Tomshik, Tomshich, I will never pronounce it correctly. It's Capitalist Unconscious is the title of the book. Does the same thing. Some wonderful texts that kind of get towards a lot of what you're talking about with Lacan and political economy and Marx. Really good stuff out there. There's a lot. It's just, I mean, Badiou is so ridiculously prolific, and I mean, one of the, if not top, I mean, Zizek would be angry, but top like understanders of Lacan, to say the least. It was great. We never get Badiou people in here, by the way, Kiddis. So this has been great for me. I'm hoping for everyone else too, but I've been indulging. This is nice.
Thanks. I wanted to say that Zizek would be happy if he heard you say that, because Zizek is frequently saying that if you have time to read my books, of course you have time to read Hegel, Badiou, and Kant, and so on and so on.
And so on and so on and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, precisely. He's some kind of political activist in psychoanalysis. He's not so much a theoretician like so many philosophers. He's a
There,
practitioner in politics.
I would really love to see more, because I know Zizek and Badiou have done talks together and different things. I'd love to see more of them, like literally just interacting, because they are, I mean, maybe not see it, but have someone animate it, because the discussions they have are fascinating, and it's generally over my head, but they clash and agree at the same time in hilarious ways. It's always been interesting to me, but thank you for that. I'm sorry I had to run to the restroom. Did we get through most of the paragraph at least, Jack? So I can move on, or should we keep going in the paragraph?
I think so. Is there anything else you wanted to hit in this paragraph?
All right, fair enough. The play of the paragraph simply is them talking through Oedipus and how it sort of stuck around inside of Lacan, and how you didn't get rid of it. You didn't dissolute it, didn't disappear. It's now playing different roles and it works differently. The next paragraph, I think, makes it a lot more clear as well. We are all the more extricated from Oedipus as we become a living example, an advertisement, a theorem in action, so as to attract our children to Oedipus. We have evolved in Oedipus. We have been structured in Oedipus, and under the neutral and benevolent eye of the substitute, we have learned the song of castration, the lack of being that is life. Yes, it is through castration that we gain access to desire. What one calls the disappearance of Oedipus is Oedipus become an idea. Only the idea can inject the venom. Oedipus has to become an idea so that it sprouts each time a new set of arms and legs, lips and mustache. In tracing back the memory deaths, your ego becomes a sort of mineral theorem which constantly proves the futility of living. We have been triangulated in Oedipus and will triangulate it in turn. From the family to the couple, from the couple to the family. In actuality, the benevolent neutrality of the analyst is very limited. It ceases the instant one stops responding, daddy mommy. It ceases the instant one introduces a little desiring machine, the tape recorder, into the analyst's office. It ceases as soon as a flow is made to circulate that does not let itself be stopped by Oedipus, the mark of the triangle. They tell you you have a libido that is too viscous or too liquid, contraindications for analysis. Does that sound a little double-bindy to me, Jack?
Nah.
Not at all. The play when you go in, the way the analyst couch works, the line here I love, it ceases the instant one introduces a little desiring machine, the tape recorder, into the analyst's office. This isn't saying that the tape recorder breaks things by being a tape recorder. It's that you have that machine, and in the process of analysis, in the analyst-analysand relationship, having that third party that's just recording, what will happen with that? What we'll do with that? What is that going to do? What is that? How does that machine connect to the rest of it? We have to keep psychoanalysis closed. You have to be safe in the room. No one outside of it. You can't have more than two. That would just be too much. It's a little bit of Guattari in here, as he is basically shitting on the core structure of psychoanalysis that itself plays the role of daddy mommy and Oedipalization. But that's what he's talking about here, the tape recorder. It ruins everything. The same way that a lot of stuff ruins the spirit of the thing or breaks the elements because they just can no longer be triangulated because you have that fourth element. Oh, dear Lord, whatever will we do with that?
Yeah, to add to that, right? This part, and part of what we're getting here is I think the reinforcement of the relationship of psychoanalysis and political economy, right? This point about Oedipus needing to be an idea, one that can only, by virtue of being an idea, inject a venom, right? What I think they're kind of getting at here is this need for, right, just like I was saying in the previous paragraph, right? Capitalism has the power to destroy and disseminate. But like we said, that third aspect of structuration is a recoding aspect. That is to say, this point they make earlier in 3.9 about the becoming concrete. This is one thing I think is part and parcel for that relationship, political economy and psychoanalysis, is that what capitalism kind of facilitates is this point about Oedipus becoming concrete, right? And being able to be an idea and congeal in classic Marx terms. At the same time, psychoanalysis facilitates that at the level of the therapeutic, right? Which I think is kind of what Bertz is getting at with this point about the tape recorder. Another way to say it is, were the BWO to be involved in recording, things would rupture, or things could rupture.
Yeah. It's unknown, untriangulated. How is that machine going to operate? How does it work? I know how our machines work. We have a clock right there that tells me when we're done. You give me money, and I tell you that you need to be Oedipalized, and we're very set up. The play is written before the actors get on stage. They've made that point dozens of times in the book already that every analyst's couch is the same and behaves the same. But introduce a tape recorder. Oh, dear Lord, the whole system's broken. What are you going to do? What the fuck? Any questions, comments on this? I'm happy to get to the next paragraph because we get to from, which is great, and some Wilhelm Reich, which will be good. All right. When Fromm denounces the existence of a psychoanalytic bureaucracy, he still doesn't go far enough because he doesn't see what the stamp of this bureaucracy is, and that an appeal to the pre-Oedipal is not enough to escape this stamp. The pre-Oedipal, like the post-Oedipal, is still a way of bringing all of desiring production, the an-Oedipal, back to Oedipus. When Reich denounces the way in which psychoanalysis joins forces with social repression, he still doesn't go far enough because he doesn't see that the tie linking psychoanalysis with capitalism is not merely ideological, that it is infinitely closer, infinitely tighter, and that psychoanalysis depends directly on an economic mechanism, whence its relationship with money, through which the decoded flows of desire, as taken up in the axiomatic of capitalism, must necessarily be reduced to a familial field, where the application of this axiomatic is carried out. Oedipus as the last word of capitalist consumption, sucking away at daddy mommy, being blocked and triangulated on the couch. So it's psychoanalysis, no less than the bureaucracy or military apparatus, is a mechanism for the absorption of surplus value. Nor is this true from the outside extrinsically. Rather, its very form and its finality are marked by this social function. It is not the pervert, nor even the autistic person who escapes psychoanalysis. The whole of psychoanalysis is an immense perversion, a drug, a radical break with reality, starting with the reality of desire. It is a narcissism, a monstrous autism, the characteristic autism and the intrinsic perversion of the machine of capital. At its most autistic, psychoanalysis is no longer measured against any reality. It no longer opens to any outside, but becomes itself the test of reality and the
Hey,
guarantor of its own test.
I'm sorry. Hey,
And muting Doug. No longer opens to any outside, but becomes itself the test of reality and the guarantor of its own test. Reality as the lack to which the inside and the outside, departure and arrival, are reduced. Psychoanalysis, index sui, with no other reference than itself or the analytic situation. There's so very, very much said here. Let's talk about Fromm and let's talk about Reich. So Erich Fromm wrote a lot of books on psychoanalysis, comparing it. The one I've read that we've talked about here mostly is Psychoanalysis and Religion, where he's really fascinated by kind of how psychoanalysis carries those things forward, plays with them. Specifically here, he spends a lot more time talking through sort of his overall critique of this idea that there is a large superstructure of psychoanalysis, that we shouldn't have such a thing, that everyone needs, that it's contingent, it's based on the person, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, he did not necessarily appeal to doing away with all of psychoanalysis or anything like that. Instead, he started from some very odd spots that they call here the pre-Oedipal, but it essentially exists and signifies the rest of the Oedipalization of knowledge and your personal emotions and creative capacities. This sort of setup that he played with, I think, is more what they're sort of talking about here. Fromm had some very interesting critiques of things. Some really good books. Is anyone else more familiar with Fromm? Because he's part of, Jack mentioned, or was just mentioned, the Frankfurt School a moment ago. That Fromm's part of that world.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? To appeal to the pre-Oedipal is to appeal to Oedipalization, right? Because there's On one hand, there's a kind of individuation right there. There's a process. On the other hand, the pre-Oedipal is on Oedipal terms, right?
Hmm. But
And like,
he he
okay,
he spent a lot of his time, just real quick, because the allegory he always used was Adam and Eve and the biting the tree of knowledge, biting the fruit of the tree of knowledge. The idea that knowledge is what kind of corrupts, sort of plays at that um, idea of guilt and shame. And he very much spent his time talking about that sort of pre-human, I think is actually how he talked about it. That pre-Oedipal state, very much talking about sort of that innocence, but it existed as pre-Oedipal. To the point, it's not like its own state of naivete. It's specifically in relation to basically an Oedipalized capitalist subject, which presupposes the larger structure, to say the least.
right, you're still in an uncanniness of representation, right?
Yes.
And that's even part of the difficulty with Reich, yeah, because Reich, this is where the typical Marxian move fails, right? At least for Deleuze and Guattari, and I think convincingly so. Is if you appeal to this problem of psychoanalysis and capitalism as simply ideology, um, you miss what psychoanalysis at least sees, right? Which is desire. You miss you miss what people want and what produces them, right? The production of the real, simply for the reasoned or the pre-conscious. Oh my God, Ken's here.
Oh, dude, Ken, we've been talking about you for like an hour and a half. You showed up with 25 minutes left. You shouldn't be here. You should leave. You don't want to be here. Because we're about to ask you a bunch of Lacan questions. Are you ready?
We even came up with a new nickname for you, Lacan.
Get out of here.
Not joking, actually. Actually, we're kind of moved on a little bit, but we are talking about psychoanalysis in general because we're in 4.3.
Mm-hmm.
You have a ton of background noise, by the way. Like,
okay.
like an air conditioner and fans and stuff.
Yeah, AC is on. Is this any better? Like I'm a little further away.
It is what it is.
Oh shit.
Mute yourself in between talking, and that would be great. So we're talking basically about Fromm and Reich's denunciations of psychoanalysis and their critiques and where that went with, because we're talking through the paragraph about how psychoanalysis in the eyes of D&G, no matter what we do, the way psychoanalysis has been born, the way Oedipus is basically built into it, even through Lacan, and they don't know about after, but I think it's fair to say after, that the structure is set in a very specific sets of ways. Fromm's critique that, hey, we shouldn't have a bureaucracy at the top of psychoanalysis doesn't go far enough, because ultimately, by even starting with the pre-Oedipal, you're assuming the Oedipal. When Reich says, hey, psychoanalysis happens to be joining with social repression, and that's fucked up, it's actually, no, it's not that they link, it's that they are one and the same, the nature of psychoanalysis. And again, this is Guattari's bell ringing throughout this paragraph. That at no point does it matter, because since a patient is paying with capital, their desire is flowing through this. Their desire is tied up. The axiomatic of capitalism necessarily is in the room at all times, pushing someone towards Oedipalization, daddy, mommy, all of these. And so it doesn't matter if you have these critiques. At its base, the form of the current psychoanalytic system is the problem and needs to be rebuilt. And I know last time you had a ton of thoughts on this, but I thought I'd at least open up the page I'm on if you want to read the text and see through it, as shared in the chat.
Thanks. Is the background noise any better? There was a sound machine on. That's what was going on.
That's much better.
Okay. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. It's just curious. So would psychoanalysis still be Oedipal if no one had to pay? or would that like make some sort of impact into this critique a little?
Oh, I mean, it would change the machine by nature. To say very cleanly, um, psychoanalysis depends directly on an economic mechanism, its relations with money, through which the decoded flows of desire, as taken up in the axiomatic of capitalism, must necessarily be reduced to a familial field where the application of this axiomatic is carried out. Oedipus, as the last word of capitalist consumption, sucking away at daddy mommy, being blocked and triangulated on the couch. So it's, and that's the line they have. So it's with the presumption, the ad hoc creation of why things are desired. So it's. And that's their play. They actually go very hard into saying it's specifically about absorption of surplus value as a mechanism, which is a hardcore. I mean, Guattari, we know he wasn't exactly a fan of psychoanalysis, especially at this point in his career, but it's pretty harsh. And there you go.
It sounds like they're almost saying that Oedipus is prior to capitalism, and I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, you can find Oedipus in the primitive, right? According to Deleuze and Guattari, Oedipus, it's the third part of representation.
And I guess I just feel like that's fudging a little, because then you say that confession, that the form of confession is prior to capital, and I don't know if I agree with that. And so like parts of psychoanalysis, absolutely. Like object relations, I'm totally on board. Like, what's his name? Frenzy. And I mean, even like Winnicott and a few people like that, where you definitely have this like master with all the knowledge. And the master is actually in the place where it believes it has all the knowledge. And then you have the subject that's created and constructed in the room. But and Freud certainly did this in the beginning, right? And that was his like major mistake, and that was the whole point of Dora. Dora wasn't a success. And then the turn later on is that people do this themselves. Like people infect themselves with this. So it is supposed, like at some point in time, the analyst becomes the subject supposed to know. Just some innocuous, absolutely meaningless gesture is a signifier that's latched onto, that's elevated to, oh, he has some sort of secret knowledge about me. But the move in late Freud and then in Lacan is acknowledging that the subject's supposed to know is a farce and it's something to be dissolved, and that it's sort of like, it's a perverse intoxicant to actually stand in that place. So I don't know if that agrees with capitalist discourse. Let me
jump in real quick because let me just jump in real quick because I want to stick on that point because I'm understanding you. I want to just move back to the idea that specifically Oedipalization exists before psychoanalytic intervention. The idea being that since in a capitalist mode of production, the familial is actually the family is effectively the training ground for how to exist within capital, and everything is focused through the mommy, daddy, me triangle, mother and father being the filter that all are seen through, that it's not psychoanalysis that gives us the Oedipus complex. On the contrary, and to go back a little bit, the subjects of psychoanalysis arrive already Oedipalized. All that psychoanalysis does is reinforce the movement and add a last burst of energy to the displacement of the entire unconscious. The idea being that that they come to this Oedipalized, not because that's their a priori condition of being human, but because that's how capitalism manufactures subjects. And psychoanalysis exists to basically reinforce that and kind of complete the cycle, or to stop someone from breaking out of that, you might say.
Yeah, I
That's my
mean,
understanding of their turn.
and that makes sense. I just would make the what I think is a reasonable point to say that psychoanalysis isn't a monolith.
Well, no, of course. We're talking specifically about their reference, and I think it's
Yeah,
aimed at Freudian and I think Lacanian of the era. Although there's still a lot of threads of this, I think, still today. But I think they're very much in reference to of the era for Guattari, especially.
yeah. Because I mean, one of the ends of analysis is to become nothing, right? One of the ends of analysis is not to see how your mommy and daddy have shaped who you are today, and then to accept that and to move on. That's not one of the passes or whatever in Lacanian psychoanalysis. So, but
No,
it
but
certainly
it is,
seems like it was
I
used
would
that
say,
way in May '68, right?
well, I would say, even today, I would argue that it's not directly, oh, you need a good relationship with mommy, daddy, but you do need a good relationship with the master signifier, the law, like all of the things that are necessarily Oedipalization, just not in the same direct, hey, this is my daddy, this is my mommy. It's more, oh, all is seen through the symbol, and that structure still exists.
Yeah. Sort of. Yeah. I mean, you make a good point. This is that whole the non-dupes airmost, those who do not let themselves be deceived by the symbolic fiction airmost, which sounds it sounds like don't rage against the machine or anything like that, but that's not quite it. The this is when Zizek talks about the idiot and the fool, and the idiot's the one who points out the king's wearing no clothes unabashedly, right?
Yes.
This is
They even say
all
that in here. They're very
bureaucracy.
clear. They agree with that in this. Like
Yeah.
as
Well,
far
that's
as they're concerned, Lacan's responsible for basically showing us how all of this works on that side. He just didn't go far enough. I mean, that's their refrain kind of always.
and then the fool sort of like takes his time. He understands that he can't change anything. He or she, they can't change anything if they get themselves killed, or if they aren't able to buy food at a grocery store, um, for the time being. So the fool is the one who plays the role of the fool. Oh, what beautiful garments you have! While plotting to overthrow or whatever. Um, but what would you like from me? I guess is my
No,
question.
this conversation, I think, is what we wanted. Like that's,
Okay.
I mean, so it's just to mention we have Kiddis here, who is Bedouin, which isn't a word, but I'm saying it is because I just love saying Badou's name with various suffixes. He's Badou-tastic, you might say. But so it's we have a couple sort of different views, and so it was like as he started talking, I was like, Jesus Christ, Ken, I'd love to have Ken in here. So just having the conversation, I think, is the bigger thing because, as you're aware, I am not an expert in these things, and so it's nice to have that sort of, your general perspective because you dig this shit a lot, and you really do like wholeheartedly believe in it, and you believe in it, I think, in a way that
I do
makes it
not.
very.
I do not believe in it. By
You
the way,
don't
no,
psychoanalysis?
no fucking way. No.
Well, whatever, you know what I mean. You have I don't know how to put it. You have an investment in it in a different way than
I
I
am
do.
invested. Yeah, I am invested. Yeah.
So as such, you have a different mentality of how the angle for these things. So it just helps a lot to just have that direction. We were going over, Kiddis posted the L diagram. I think it's called the L, or is it the R? I can never remember.
It's
Um,
it's lambda. Yeah, it's
yeah,
the
it's
L.
lambda. Um, and we were describing it and going through sort of that setup, and that's when you first came up, as Jean Claire said. So because it's one of those things where now they're starting to get into this deep critique of some things that are really sort of core to their belief structure. And I think if I were to say, it's not so much that they're saying all psychoanalysis is shit. They're saying psychoanalysis as it exists, and they're being very particular with the usage of the representation here, because their move is to start talking about schizoanalysis. They're not saying that there is nothing that can be done within analysis. It's this way that we do psychoanalysis is fucked up, because psychoanalysis kind of plays the role in the areas of capitalism where family failed to Oedipalize someone. Don't worry, you got your psychoanalyst there in the corner waiting. is kind of the setup that's there. And I would argue that we see that even today, modern, like not even psychoanalysis. As someone who went through therapy in a lot of different ways, it's the core of shit. Like it really is.
Yeah, you have your outsiders, but like there are people in there who aren't going to try to funnel you in to being happy and or being normal in an abnormal situation or something like that, right? But definitely, you gotta watch out for that, because the majority will sort of have the belief that that you're the problem, not the world, right? Things are great. You just have a bad attitude.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, your parents didn't fix you up right. Here we are to make sure, because we need productive people.
Brooks, I would like to make a comment if I can, please.
No, please.
Ken wasn't here, and I know Ken. I think he remembers me from Lacan group. But the previous paragraphs that we were reading, or the main paragraphs we were reading today, I think, I think either they are some kind of critics against psychoanalysis, or maybe psychoanalytic practice at the time the book was written, or on the other side, they are maybe some kind of criticism of the way capitalism may capitalize, in quotes, psychoanalysis. I think this because first of all, I'm not really familiar with Deleuze-Guattari's writings about capitalism. I didn't read this book, and I'm not sure if they are if they're dealing with criticism in psychoanalysis per se. And the second one was because you can find the same kind of critics in psychoanalysis on Lacan. And you can find the same criticism in Freud, for example. And in some sense, maybe they're not being really critical about psychoanalysis as much as they are being critical about how the machines of capitalism can make use of psychoanalysis in this, or maybe the terms with which psychoanalysis is dealing with, like the Oedipal Oedipal stage or Oedipal development, the idea of Oedipal development, and so on. Maybe it would be easier in some sense if we could go to those critical points where they are criticizing, or they're talking about psychoanalysis, because we went through certain points, but as I stopped to those points, I wasn't really sure what Deleuze and Guattari are really talking about, because this is too little text for me to understand what they're talking about. But the points I made earlier were about maybe to give some glimpse, or to widen the view and the perspective of analysis, of psychoanalysis, which can may elaborate it further, but unfortunately we didn't have him during the reading this time. By this, I mean, maybe if we go to the text, maybe even with another paragraph, or maybe if we go another time, because maybe we don't have time this time.
Actually,
It could be clearer.
the next paragraph is a bit long for us to start. I would ask if you can come back next week. We're not going to start it today, because I will finish reading it, and then we will hit the hour mark, and I try not to make this go to 2 to 3, 4 hours. We've done that before. It sucks. The 2.5 hours is when everyone's brain starts dying. But next week we can go. The next paragraph actually is very crisp in their specific critique of psychoanalysis and Oedipalization, and the way psychoanalysis operates. Let me read 2 sentences from it, and we'll discuss, and then we'll close out, because I think it works. I'm just going to read the beginning. Psychoanalysis clearly states clearly that unconscious representation can never be apprehended independently of the deformations, disguises, or displacements it undergoes. Unconscious representation, therefore, comprises essentially, by virtue of its own law, a represented that is displaced in relation to an agency in a constant state of displacement. But from this, 2 unwarranted conclusions are drawn. That this agency can be discovered by way of the displaced represented, and this precisely because this agency itself belongs to representation as a non-represented representative, or as a lack that juts out into the overfull of representation. I'm just going to keep reading. Fuck it, we're going over. This results from the fact that displacement refers to very different movements. At times, the movement through which desiring production is continually overcoming the limit, becoming deterritorialized, causing its flows to escape, going beyond the threshold of representation. At times, on the contrary, the movement through which the limit itself is displaced and now passes to the interior of the representation that performs the artificial reterritorializations of desire. If the displacing agency can be concluded from the displaced, this is only true in the second sense, where molar representation is organized around a representative that displaces the represented. But this is certainly not true in the first sense, where the molecular elements are continually passing through the links in the chain. We have seen in this perspective how the law of representation perverted the productive forces of the unconscious and induced in its very structure a false image that caught desire in its trap, the impossibility of concluding from the prohibition as to what is actually prohibited. Yes, Oedipus is indeed the displaced represented. Yes, castration is indeed the representative, the displacing agency, the signifier. But none of that constitutes an unconscious material, nor does any of it concern the productions of the unconscious. Oedipus, castration, the signifier, etc., exist at the crossroads of 2 operations of capture. One, where repressive social production becomes replaced by beliefs. The other, where repressed desiring production finds itself replaced by representations. To be sure, it is not psychoanalysis that makes us believe. Oedipus and castration are demanded, then demanded again, and these demands come from elsewhere and from deeper down. But psychoanalysis did find the following means and fills the following function: causing beliefs to survive even after repudiation, causing those who no longer believe in anything to continue believing, reconstituting a private territory for them, a private Urstaat, a private capital. Dreams of capital. Dreams as capital, said Freud. Does that help at all, Kedis? Because it's actually, I think, a pretty crisp set of paragraphs. There's some terms in there that if you're newer to D&G and if you're coming in, there's some terms I'm happy to sort of explain and talk through, but it's actually a really crisp sort of almost manifesto of how they feel about it. It isn't, to be clear, it's not psychoanalysis that makes us believe Oedipus and castration are demanded. These things are demanded. Psychoanalysis found a way to make us believe after repudiation, after we don't believe anymore. We continue believing this private capital, private Urstaat, private territory that we are given when we no longer have those sort of large-scale beliefs, those dreams, you may say. Now we get to have just capital and continue somehow having the beliefs underneath. It's a really, I like this setup, but it's a pretty crisp thing to be great. So hopefully that helped a little. Please, comments, go for it.
I'll try to make a short comment. Just in general, this is a really dense paragraph, and I think
Yes.
it is related to what we read before this one. If we start talking about the important elements in this paragraph, I think it's going to be longer than the time we have. Maybe it would be interesting to start with the points of this paragraph in the next session.
Yeah, next session we'll do a rereading. I think we have a couple minutes, so I think it's worth going through a couple of them. Just to try to top line it, the way meaning is produced for Deleuze and Guattari is through the syntheses, the sort of lived experience of desiring machines, partial objects that connect, disconnect, and the resultant things become both the plane of consistency, our body without organs, but also our subjectivity. We are produced in a very real sense from mass amounts of these. From the other direction, we have representations. We have to be able to talk to people. As such, we use words for things. So this language existed before us. I didn't get born and then learn a language alongside everyone. I was born and taught a language. When I'm taught a language, I'm told words mean things. The example that they use, which I very much like, is if you had old time when the first language was invented and written and they had the letter A, which meant water, hanging out over a lake, someone who didn't speak the language or read. What is that? Oh, that's water. So then they point to the symbol. They're not talking about the body. They're talking about the symbol. We're in a place now of representation where it's not directly connected to anything that we might call, sort of actual, concrete. It's disconnected from lived experience of desiring machines. As such, when I say or tell you that you need water to survive, or in Oedipus's case, you want to fuck your mom, you want to commit incest. These things aren't telling my desiring machines. My desiring machines don't know what the fuck any of this means, but I get told what I want, and as such, I create a very specific representation, a displaced represented. It's this thing where I say I want water in my head. What does that mean? And it means this perfectly crisp, cool glass of water that I see on a commercial. And the image of that sits with me. And that becomes what I desire. Well, it's not. My desire machines don't have any clue. They just want and go. But I've been told that's what I want. And so I have this signifier. I have this displaced represented that takes place of my actual desire. The desiring machines still go there. The power sort of gets subsumed into that. But now, in this moment, I no longer have direct connection with my desires. Now I'm being told what I want. And this happens not just with water or Oedipus, but in a capitalist world, fucking everything. And so as these things sort of play with us, as these bits of representation go into us, we have this really odd thing that happens where now we are playing with strata and beliefs that are interconnecting representations rather than like a truly lived, here's my understanding of the world only. So specifically, psychoanalysis plays with representation, comes back to that, and doesn't necessarily create beliefs. Representation as a thing does that. There's an interplay, but psychoanalysis gives us a way to have beliefs survive even after we understand, like, imminently that they're silly, or not part of or not connected to things. They cause beliefs to survive after repudiation. They cause those who no longer believe in anything to continue believing, because it forms and plays with our desire. If I till a field with very specific lines and the water begins running through for irrigation, it doesn't matter if later on I go through and I change half of the field. That water is still slamming up against those things. The structure is there for desire to flow as it does, even if I don't have the representations anymore, even if I'm not a Christian. I'm not. I kind of never was. That I don't even know what that means, really. But my desire flows kind of mimic that underlying thing because there's a way I was raised. That's what are these representations? Well, the structure's there. I'm put into it. And that private version of things, the Brooks version of representation, rather than the sort of global, here is what I'm doing inside of society. Here's my roles. My family does X, my alliant, which is the group I'm with, does Y, or we all do things for the despot because he gives me orders. Now it's privatized. Now it's me. I, as a subject, am forced to figure out what the fuck I believe in. I don't really believe in anything, but I still believe in the law, these things that are unknown that I'm unable to sort of speak to. And this is what they say psychoanalysis does. They say this structure does at a core level to our unconscious. Is that fair, Jack? Is that a decent summary of that? Because it's a really complex, and we will next week, Kedis, join us. We will reread and go sentence by fucking sentence, because I agree with you. It's incredibly dense, but I feel like it's incredibly important.
I'll try to make a note this time, and for the second week, I'll get it written, and I maybe will go to some of the main points of this one. But
That'd be
I
great.
hope I hope we have also can, because some things from psychoanalysis are really hard.
This part, I would agree with you for sure. I'll do my best to try to get Ken in here, but I think here we can talk a little bit more generally about representation and specifically the imaginary and the symbolic, because that's
Mhm.
their, like, I think the more generic. We don't have to necessarily go into like, here's Lacan's interpretation or this or that. It's when they talk about this, they're talking about the way that the law, for example, works, represented, displaced in relation to an agency. We can, I think, use these terms. I'm pretty confident I'm able to help define and lay them out, and I think we can actually go through, even if he doesn't show up. But we will all just pray for Ken,
Oh, of
like a
course,
good,
of
like
course,
good pious
of course.
people. We will pray for Ken.
I think it will be fine either way. But for example, if we wanted to make the relation between what happens between the imaginary and the symbolic intervention, I think we might shortly need to go to the schema I showed you, and it will be more easier to catch what's going on in this relation, even with the relation to the laws of which you were talking before. For example, the way in which the relation of me is with other members of society, or in a certain situation, and so on and so on. Which is not really thought in or put in plain words in what somebody is saying, but it's there because, as we told earlier, it is unconscious. All that. It's not that when somebody is speaking doesn't think of that. He's maybe projecting himself subconsciously he's abiding subconsciously by those laws.
Well, and here's
And
where you're getting into 100% why we need to spend time on this, because this paragraph is the last one. Like, after this, they aren't going back. This is our chance to really spend some time. And here is their critique of how they see psychoanalysis working. Here's how psychoanalysis functions. Here's these elements, because the very next thing that they're going to be talking about is how schizoanalysis works against this. This is the last step. We're about to hit the peak of that mountain, and down the other side is schizoanalysis, and there's no slowing down. So we need to do our best collectively to understand, here is their critique, here's how they see it functioning, because, having read this book a few times, I do believe their conception around how schizoanalysis should function, despite my distaste for the term, I think is much more in line with how I would love to see a way for us to figure out how to turn that into an actual machine element or a way of working. This is the last chance. So anyone who's got issues, questions, anything around schizoanalysis we've been talking about, this next week will be like that's it. So this next week will be our last chance to go over Lacan and Freud. From here on out, it is straight juxtaposition of everything. And so we need to actually have a position to juxtapose, and it's important. So we will do that. If that sounds good to you, Kedis, Doug, we'd love to have you, by the way. And I'm glad I can give you chills still. It's been a couple of years. I'm glad I can still affect you that way, baby.
Great.
But
I'll try to be prepared and in time on schedule. I think
Brilliant.
I'll be there.
Love it. We will be putting up an event, so keep an eye out. Let me see. You are already set as Duluth, so we'll ping everyone. You'll get a ping. So we'll do what we can next week. I look forward to it.
Great.
Thank all of you for joining us. This was wonderful. As always, just thanks everyone for doing this. It's my highlight of the week every week. I love all you fucking people.